72 hours stood between Angelica Thornton and utter bankruptcy. A relentless plague of invasive brown snails was devouring her family's legacy, stripping the organic vines bare overnight. Chemical sprays were strictly forbidden. The bank was circling, so she did the only logical thing left. She unleashed the flock. Angelica Thornton knelt in the damp, unforgiving soil of her family's vineyard, the cold Willamette Valley mud seeping through the knees of her denim work pants. Between her trembling thumb and forefinger, she held a single, devastated Pinot Noir leaf. It was riddled with jagged holes, the edges browning and fragile like burned paper. Beneath the leaf, clinging stubbornly to the delicate stem, sat the culprit, a Cornu aspersum, the European brown garden snail. It was no larger than a marble, its shell a spiral of mottled brown and cream, but it represented a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Angelica crushed the shell between her fingers with a sickening crunch, wiping the slime on her jeans, but the victory was entirely hollow. As she looked down the rows of the 40-acre estate, she didn't just see one snail. She saw hundreds of thousands of them. They took out the entire lower block overnight, Abby, a gravelly voice stated from behind her. Angelica didn't have to turn around to know the expression on Thomas Dempsey's face. Thomas, her head viticulturist, and the man who had worked alongside her late father for 3 decades, sounded completely defeated. The deep lines framing his mouth were set in a grim, downward curve, and his calloused hands hung uselessly at his sides. "How much did we lose?" Angelica asked, her voice tight. 3 acres of primary shoots, down to the wood," Thomas replied, kicking a clod of dirt. "We tried the copper tape on the trunks. We laid down the organic iron phosphate bait. The rain just washed it away. It's the wettest spring we've had in 40 years, and the snails are breeding faster than we can bait them. If they hit the upper terraces—" "I know," Angelica interrupted softly. "If they hit the upper terraces, we don't have a harvest. And if we don't have a harvest, the bank takes Thornton Crest." The vineyard had been her father's dream, a pioneer project in organic viticulture, long before it was fashionable. When he passed away unexpectedly 2 years ago, Angelica had walked away from a lucrative marketing career in Chicago to keep the estate alive. She had inherited his passion, his encyclopedic knowledge of soil health, and, unfortunately, his massive line of credit. She was currently $1.2 million in debt. Thornton Crest's organic certification was the only thing allowing them to sell their grapes at a premium, keeping the fragile financial ecosystem afloat. "Abby, you know there's a solution," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a reluctant whisper. "Metaldehyde, a heavy-duty chemical moluscicide. 1 spray and these things are dead by morning. And we lose our organic certification instantly," Angelica shot back, finally standing up to face him. "We breach our contracts with the boutique wineries. We become just another conventional vineyard, and we won't get half the price per ton. It would ruin us anyway." Before Thomas could argue, the crunching of gravel announced an arriving vehicle. A sleek, silver Range Rover crept up the main driveway, an obnoxious beacon of wealth against the rustic backdrop of the struggling farm. Angelica felt a familiar knot of anger tighten in her stomach. It was Richard Ortiz. Ortiz owned the sprawling 800-acre corporate vineyard that bordered Thornton Crest to the east. He was a man who viewed farming purely through the lens of spreadsheets, chemical yields, and market dominance. For the past year, he had been hovering like a vulture, eager to absorb Angelica's land into his empire. The Range Rover's door clicked open and Richard stepped out, impeccably dressed in a tailored vest and spotless leather boots that had clearly never seen actual field work. "Morning, Angelica." "Thomas," Richard called out, a sympathetic yet entirely hollow smile plastered on his tanned face. He walked over to the edge of the vine rows, deliberately stopping before his boots could touch the mud. "I saw the damage from the ridge. It's an absolute tragedy what's happening over here." "What do you want, Richard?" Angelica asked, crossing her arms. "I'm here as a neighbor, Abby," he said smoothly, adjusting his silver watch. "It's a tough year for everyone, But frankly, you're drowning. The local agricultural board is talking. Your little organic experiment is failing, and this snail infestation is threatening to spill over onto my property. I had to spray my western blocks twice this week, just to establish a perimeter. Angelica's eyes narrowed. Your aggressive pesticide spraying is exactly why I'm overrun, Richard. You wiped out the ground beetles, the frogs, and the natural predatory birds in the valley. The snails fled your toxic wasteland and found a safe haven here. Richard chuckled, a patronizing sound that made Angelica want to scream. Nature's a business, my dear. You conquer it or it conquers you, which brings me to my point. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded document. I'm willing to increase my buyout offer by 5%. It's enough to clear your debt with the bank and leave you a modest sum to start fresh somewhere else. Chicago, perhaps? Angelica didn't even look at the paper. Thornton Crest isn't for sale. Angelica, be reasonable, Richard sighed, dropping the facade of friendliness. Your farm is defaulting in under 30 days. The bank is going to auction this land, and I'll end up buying it for pennies on the dollar anyway. I'm offering you a graceful exit. Take it. Get off my land, Richard, Angelica said, her voice dropping to a dangerous ICU register. Richard held his hands up in mock surrender. Suit yourself, but when the bank locks the gates, don't say I didn't throw you a lifeline. He turned, climbed back into his pristine SUV, and drove away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the damp air. Thomas looked at her, his eyes full of sorrow. He's an arrogant son of a bitch, Abby. But he's not wrong about the timeline. We are out of options. No, Angelica said, her jaw setting into a stubborn line. She turned back toward the farmhouse. My father didn't spend 30 years building this soil just for me to poison it or hand it over to a corporate suit. There has to be another way. I'll find one. That night, surrounded by towering stacks of agricultural journals, university studies, and her father's old leather-bound diaries, Angelica scoured the internet for a miracle. She read about introducing predatory decollate snails, but they would take years to establish. She looked into manual removal, calculating that she would need a small army of workers she couldn't afford. At 3 a.m., her eyes burning, and her coffee long gone cold, she stumbled upon a documentary clip about a historic wine estate in Stellenbosch, South Africa. The vineyard had faced a similar crisis with pests. Their solution wasn't a chemical, it was biological, and it looked completely ridiculous. Angelica sat up straight, the glow of the laptop illuminating the slow, daring smile spreading across her tired face. She quickly pulled up her banking app. She had one credit card left with a limit of $5,000. It was time to make a very weird phone call. 4 days later, a massive rusted livestock transport truck groaned its way up the narrow winding dirt road of Thornton Crest. Word travels fast in the Willamette Valley. A small crowd had already gathered near the property line. Richard Ortiz was there, leaning against the hood of his Range Rover, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. Beside him stood a few other conventional farmers from the valley, drawn by the irresistible gravity of a spectacle. Angelica stood near the barn, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs as Thomas directed the truck driver to back up toward the main irrigation pond. I still think you've lost your mind, Abby, Thomas muttered, looking at the manifest clipboard in his hand. $3,800 for this. Trust the process, Thomas, Angelica said, though her stomach was performing acrobatics. The truck hissed to a halt. The driver, a burly man in a faded trucker hat, hopped down and unlatched the heavy rear ramp. 80 head just like you ordered, Ms. Thornton, though I gotta say this is the strangest delivery I've made to a vineyard. With a loud clatter, the metal ramp slammed into the dirt. For a moment there was silence. Then a cacophony of frantic, high-pitched quacking erupted from the darkness of the trailer. Suddenly, a tidal wave of feathers poured out of the truck. 80 Indian runner ducks surged down the ramp in a chaotic, unified mass. Unlike normal farm ducks that waddled low to the ground, Indian runners stood entirely upright, like feathered bowling pins with legs. They didn't waddle, they ran. they flooded out into the morning mist, a frantic sea of white, fawn, and black feathers, honking and tripping over each other. They sprinted wildly in a circle, panicked by the new environment, before making a collective, uncoordinated dash toward the irrigation pond. With 80 consecutive splashes, they hit the water, instantly transforming the quiet morning into a loud, splashing circus. From the fence line, Richard Ortiz burst into booming, theatrical laughter. "Ducks!" Richard yelled, wiping a tear from his eye. "You're fighting a biblical plague with a petting zoo. Oh, Angelica, this is priceless. Ah, I should have brought my camera. Are you going to charge admission?" The other farmers chuckled, shaking their heads in second-hand embarrassment. Angelica ignored them, marching over to the edge of the pond. She watched the ducks bobbing in the water, aggressively preening their feathers and quacking at the sky. Indian runner ducks were uniquely suited for this exact job. They possessed an insatiable appetite for insects, slugs, and snails. More importantly, they couldn't fly, meaning they wouldn't escape the vineyard, and their upright stature meant they could reach deep into the vine canopies without eating the grapes themselves. In theory, they were the perfect, environmentally friendly exterminators. But as Angelica watched them float aimlessly, ignoring the snail-infested vines just 30 yards away, a cold spike of doubt pierced her chest. "All right, let's get them to work," Angelica said, grabbing a long herding stick. For the next 3 hours, Angelica and Thomas ran themselves ragged, trying to herd 80 stubborn birds out of the pond and into the vine rows. It was a humiliating disaster. Whenever they managed to push a group into the first block of Pinot Noir, the ducks would panic, duck under the lowest trellises, and sprint directly back to the safety of the water. They showed absolutely zero interest in the snails. "They're terrified, Abby," Thomas panted, leaning heavily on his stick, completely out of breath. "They've been in a transport truck for 2 days. They don't know what this place is, they just want to hide." By dusk, the ducks were safely huddled in the barn, and Angelica was covered in mud and duck feces. She walked the rows with a flashlight. The snails were everywhere, glistening in the beam of light, systematically chewing through the remaining green shoots. Her heart sank. She had bet her family's entire legacy on 80 confused birds. The next 2 days were an agonizing exercise in futility. The ducks refused to forage. They stayed tightly packed together, grazing only on the short grass near the water, ignoring the vines entirely. Meanwhile, the destruction continued. The snails were advancing to the middle blocks. The local agricultural inspector issued a formal warning to Thornton Crest regarding pest control negligence. To make matters infinitely worse, the final notice of default arrived in the mail. The bank was initiating foreclosure proceedings. Angelica had 14 days to clear a minimum payment of $200,000, or the gates would be padlocked. On the morning of the 4th day, Angelica sat on the porch of the farmhouse, cradling a mug of black coffee. The sky was a bruised, heavy gray, threatening more rain. She felt a profound, crushing emptiness. Richard Ortiz had won. He would buy the land, bulldoze her father's organic soil, and spray it with enough chemicals to make it glow in the dark. Thomas walked up the porch steps, sitting heavily in the rocking chair beside her. He didn't say a word. He just handed her a small envelope. It was his resignation, pending the sale of the farm. "I'm sorry, kid," Thomas whispered softly. "I gotta look for work before the whole valley finishes pruning." I held on as long as I could. Angelica took the envelope, a single tear cutting a warm track down her cold cheek. "I know, Thomas. You've been amazing. I was foolish to think this would work." She stood up to go inside and call the bank to concede. But before her hand touched the doorknob, a strange sound drifted up from the valley floor. It wasn't the frantic, panicked quacking of the past 3 days. It was a low, rhythmic, unified chatter, a sound of intense, focused activity. Angelica frowned, stepping off the porch. She walked quickly down the hill, Thomas trailing confusedly behind her. As they crested the small rise overlooking the lower vineyard block, Angelica stopped dead in her tracks, her coffee mug slipping from her fingers and shattering on the gravel path. The 80 Indian runner ducks were no longer huddled by the pond. Over the night, the recent rains had brought the snails out in unprecedented droves, coating the lower trunks of the vines. Something in the ducks' primal instincts had finally clicked. The flock was moving through the rows in a tight, militaristic formation. They weren't running frantically. They were marching. As they moved, their long necks darted out with lightning speed. Snack, crunch, swallow. They were devastatingly efficient. A duck would spot a snail hidden deep within the foliage, stretch its neck up, snatch the pest off the leaf without disturbing a single grape bud, and swallow it whole. They worked as a collective organism, sweeping down row 1, clearing it completely of snails, and pivoting seamlessly to row 2. "Mother of God," Thomas breathed, his eyes wide. Angelica watched, paralyzed with shock and sudden, overwhelming hope. In less than 20 minutes, the flock had cleared an entire half-acre of the worst infestation on the property. They were relentless, insatiable machines, turning the plague that was destroying Thornton Crest into a high-protein breakfast. The ducks were working. The biological gamble was paying off. But as Angelica watched the flock advance toward the eastern perimeter, bordering Richard Ortiz's property, she noticed something chilling. The soil near the property line was discolored, a sickly, yellowish hue, and a strange, sharp chemical odor hung heavily in the air, drifting over the fence from Ortiz Estates. A few of the ducks that had wandered too close to the boundary line suddenly stopped, staggering and shaking their heads violently. The real danger to Thornton Crest wasn't just the snails, it was the neighbor. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded Angelica's veins as she sprinted toward the eastern property line. The triumphant marching of her flock had dissolved into scattered, distressed honking. 4 of her pristine Indian runner ducks were thrashing in the damp grass near the wire fence separating Thornton Crest from Ortiz Estates. Their slender necks twisted at unnatural angles, and white foam bubbled from their bills. Thomas grabbed the transport crates. "Now!" Angelica screamed, dropping to her knees in the saturated soil. She reached for the nearest duck, a beautiful, fawn-colored female, wrapping her arms around the convulsing bird. The animal's heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her palms. The soil here didn't smell like the rich, earthy loam of the rest of the vineyard. It reeked of sulfur, ammonia, and something aggressively synthetic, a sharp chemical tang that burned the back of Angelica's throat. Thomas arrived chest-heaving, sliding the plastic crates into the mud. Together, they gently loaded the 4 incapacitated birds. "Is it bird flu?" Thomas asked, his face pale beneath his weathered cap. "If it's a contagion, the state will cull the entire flock by sunset." "No," Angelica said, her voice shaking with a potent mix of fear and mounting fury. She pointed to the ground. The lush clover that usually carpeted their side of the fence line was curled, blackened, and weeping a sickly yellow sap. "Look at the cover crop. It's chemically burned. And look at the snails." Scattered among the dying clover were dozens of empty snail shells, but they hadn't been crushed by ducks. They were melted, leaving behind viscous trails of blue-dyed slime. "Metaldehyde," Thomas breathed, recognizing the signature dye of commercial molluscicide bait. "And an organophosphate herbicide. But Abby, he sprayed this on our side of the fence. State agricultural law mandates a 50-foot buffer zone for conventional farms bordering organic land. He's completely breached the line." "He didn't just breach it, Thomas," Angelica growled, standing up and staring through the wire at the perfectly manicured, sterile rows of Ortiz Estates. "He intentionally saturated our perimeter. He knew the ducks would forage toward the property line. He's trying to poison the flock and contaminate our soil, so we lose our organic certification. If the Agricultural Board tests this soil and finds synthetic pesticides, our contracts are voided instantly." They rushed the sick ducks back to the barn. For the next 12 hours, Angelica didn't leave their side. Under the hurried phone instructions of Dr. Harrison Caldwell, an avian veterinarian from Portland, she and Thomas administered activated charcoal through plastic syringes, forcing the black liquid down the birds' throats to absorb the neurotoxins. They flushed their systems with saline and kept them warm under heat lamps. By dawn, 3 of the ducks were weakly standing, drinking clean water from a shallow trough. The 4th, the little fawn female, had not survived the night. Angelica buried the duck beneath the old weeping willow near her father's farmhouse. As she patted the soil down, her grief crystallized into a weaponized anger. Richard Ortiz had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "We call the state board," Thomas said, bringing her a fresh cup of coffee. "Oh, we report the drift." "Drift implies an accident," Angelica replied, her eyes locked on the eastern ridge. "Richard will claim the wind caught his sprayers. He'll pay a minor negligence fine out of his petty cash drawer, and the board will still revoke our organic status because the chemicals are present on our land. The bank will foreclose on Monday. We need proof of malice. We need to prove he did it on purpose." Thomas rubbed his bearded chin, his eyes suddenly widening. "The deer. What about them? Last month before the snails hit, the black-tailed deer were eating the young shoots on the eastern perimeter," Thomas explained, his words tumbling out rapidly. "I mounted 3 motion-activated trail cameras on the oak trees along the fence line to track their feeding patterns. I never took them down." Angelica's heart leaped. They ran to the utility ATV, tearing off down the dirt paths toward the contaminated zone. The morning fog clung heavily to the vines as Thomas scaled the old oak tree, unclipping a small, camouflage-painted camera from a high branch. They pulled the SD card, plugged it into Angelica's rugged field laptop sitting on the ATV hood, and held their breath as the files loaded. They scrubbed through hundreds of mundane clips of deer grazing, raccoons passing in the night, and wind blowing through the leaves. Then a thumbnail caught Angelica's eye. It was timestamped 2 nights ago at 2:14 a.m. She clicked play. The black and white infrared footage showed a massive enclosed John Deere tractor rolling down Ortiz's side of the fence. But instead of the spray booms pointing down at his own vines, the driver, clearly identifiable as Gregory Higgins, Ortiz's Vineyard manager, had hydraulically tilted the massive mechanical arms over the property wire. A thick, billowing fog of chemical mist blasted directly into Thornton Crest, coating the organic clover, the vines, and the ground. Gregory even slowed the tractor down to ensure maximum saturation. It wasn't accidental drift. It was a calculated, illegal chemical assault. "Gotcha," Angelica whispered, a fierce, victorious smile breaking across her face. She didn't call the local agricultural board. She called David Lawson, the senior enforcement director for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and then she called the regional director of the EPA. The following afternoon, the usually quiet courtyard of Thornton Crest looked like a federal staging ground. 4 white government SUVs were parked on the gravel, men and women in windbreakers meticulously taking soil samples, swabbing leaves, and photographing the chemical burns along the property line. Richard Ortiz arrived in his silver Range Rover, screeching to a halt near the barn. He stepped out, his face a mask of righteous indignation, flanked by his corporate attorney. "Angelica, what is the meaning of this circus?" Richard demanded, storming toward her. "You have state agents crawling all over the perimeter. If you're trying to stage some sort of desperate sympathy play before the bank takes your land, it's pathetic." Angelica stood her ground, her arms crossed, the 76 remaining Indian runner ducks quacking happily in the background as they devoured snails in the central blocks. Beside her stood Director David Lawson, holding a tablet. "Mr. Ortiz," Lawson said, his tone devoid of any warmth, "we are conducting an investigation into intentional environmental sabotage, illegal application of restricted neurotoxins, and violation of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act." Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "She's a failing farmer looking for a scapegoat. I sprayed my property. If there was a minor wind drift, my insurance will cover her paltry losses. But you cannot prove intent, and her organic certification is completely compromised." Angelica didn't say a word. She simply turned her laptop around and hit play on the trail camera footage. Richard's smug expression dissolved in real time. The color drained from his face as he watched his own vineyard manager systematically poison his neighbor's land. He watched the boom arms tilt over the fence. He watched the malicious, undeniable intent play out in crisp infrared video. That is unauthorized," Richard stammered, stepping back. "Gregory must have gone rogue. I never ordered this." "Save it for the federal judge, Mr. Ortiz," Lawson interrupted, snapping the laptop shut. "We've already seized your chemical logs and farm management software. We found the digital work order you signed authorizing this specific late-night application. You are facing millions in EPA fines, potential criminal charges for agricultural sabotage, and a mandatory shutdown of your current operations pending a full soil remediation review." Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Angelica, his eyes wide with the realization that the woman he had tried to crush had just systematically dismantled his entire empire. "Get off my land, Richard," Angelica said, echoing her words from a week ago, but this time with the weight of absolute victory. "And don't come back." The fallout was swift and merciless. Within 48 hours, the story leaked to the agricultural press. The scandal sent Ortiz Estates' corporate stock into a tailspin. To avoid a catastrophic public relations nightmare, Richard's board of directors forced his immediate resignation, severing all ties with him. To settle the imminent civil lawsuit Angelica brought against them, the corporation agreed to an astronomical, out-of-court settlement. On the day the bank was scheduled to foreclose on Thornton Crest, Angelica walked into the local branch and slammed a certified check on the manager's desk, clearing her father's $1.2 million debt entirely, with enough capital left over to run the vineyard for the next 10 years, because the state verified the chemical application was a contained, malicious attack on the perimeter. Thornton Crest retained its organic certification for the remaining 95% of the acreage. And then, the real magic happened. The Indian runner ducks, unfazed by the drama, continued their relentless patrol. They swept through the Pinot Noir blocks like a feathered army, consuming millions of brown garden snails. Without the pests destroying the canopy, the vines exploded with vibrant, healthy growth. The ducks' nutrient-rich manure naturally fertilized the soil, accelerating the recovery of the plants. When autumn arrived, the Willamette Valley witnessed one of the most spectacular harvests in its history. Angelica and Thomas stood at the sorting tables, watching the clusters of dark, flawless Pinot Noir grapes roll down the conveyor belts. The fruit was pristine, bursting with concentrated sugars and complex acids. The organic soil, undisturbed by heavy machinery and enriched by the ducks, had produced a yield that surpassed even her father's greatest vintages. 2 years later, Thornton Crest released their flagship wine. Angelica designed the label herself, a minimalist, elegant silhouette of an upright duck stamped in gold foil. She named it the Runner's Reserve. It scored 98 points in a blind tasting by a premier international wine syndicate, instantly becoming a coveted bottle among collectors and putting her family's vineyard permanently on the map of world-class winemakers. On a crisp October evening, Angelica sat on the porch of the farmhouse, sipping a glass of the Reserve. The valley below was painted in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Down by the irrigation pond, a flock of over 200 Indian runner ducks splashed happily in the twilight, a permanent, vital part of the farm's ecosystem. Thomas walked up the steps, holding 2 fresh glasses. He clinked his glass against hers, a silent acknowledgement of the hell they had walked through and the paradise they had saved. She hadn't just rescued her father's dream, she had evolved it. She had trusted nature when everyone else told her to fight it, and nature, with all its chaotic, noisy, feathered glory, had fought back for her. What would you have done if a millionaire neighbor tried to destroy everything you loved? Angelica's brilliant Duck Army strategy proves that nature always finds a way to win against corporate greed. If this story of justice and farming brilliance inspired you, hit that like button right now. Share this incredible, true-life victory with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of underdogs taking back their power.